elected and remained the congregation's rabbi for many years. In 1854, the synagogue of a second congregation was dedicated. They liked Dallas. No, they had no link to the Dallas community. It just is happenstance that their Reformed congregation was named Congregation Emmanuel. It was actually bigger than Cherith, Israel, and followed the German tradition. So again, even like a town like San Francisco, where they're so far away from the norms that were happening in other parts of the country, we're still faced with that sort of, Litvak Galatianer kind of German versus Eastern European challenge that was still a presence. And so after many changes in leadership, the congregation hired Dr. Elkin Cohn, who introduced reform practices. And this was a huge shift for San Francisco. Men and women sat together, a choir and an organ were used during services, religious poems in Hebrew were omitted from the service, and the congregation was successful and soon considered constructing a larger building. Now, as the Jewish community of San Francisco expanded, other organizations added life to the community. In 1857, for example, a Hebrew Young Man's Literacy Association was meeting every week to discuss politics, religion, history, and some other forms of Jewish interest. A number of Jewish settlers also became active in civic affairs. By 1865, there were 4,000 Jews living among the 119,000 residents of San Francisco. Now, as I think I pointed out last week, do you remember what Levi Strauss would give his students that did well in Hebrew school? All right, so I saw Jennifer mouth it and Carol did this. Right, he would give them these large gold coins. I still, as a Hebrew teacher, find myself I don't know if I'm envious or I just really am so curious to see what those actually looked like. But, I know Beth Torah, we could finally pay off our mortgage if we just had one of those gold coins. Anyway, so when it comes down to it, obviously this was a congregation of great wealth. And there was more property among them than in New York. Yet, taken as a whole, they owned more real estate, commanded more wealth comparatively than anywhere else in the United States at that time. 10 members of Temple Emmanuel, the principal city of San Francisco, had an aggregate wealth of $45 million in the 1870s. Can you imagine how much? So they controlled to a great extent primarily the mercantile business. So put that in perspective of that was $45 million in 1870s dollars. Let your brain just implode about how many billions that would be worth today. So now both congregations, both Cherith and Temple Emmanuel, are under the Reform movement. Now, I want to introduce you to a gentleman who actually was a writer, a German in 1862. Israel Benjamin, a German Jew, wrote 3 Years in America, a book about his travels. And here's what Benjamin's observations were about the San Francisco Jewish community. Can anyone volunteer to read for me today?
I can.
Sure, thanks.
This is Sherry. All hearts were deeply touched by the swift progress and rapid prosperity of the community. In a few years, plains and mountains had been converted into peaceful habitations. Out of the Sahara of the desert, they had come into Canaan. That which in Europe had been barely possible in a long period of time was accomplished within 8 years in America. The Jewish communities have fully organized themselves by the appointment of rabbis, the building of beautiful synagogues, and the direction of schools. And this way they promise to become a blessing for generations to come.
Awesome. So I think that, the Jewish community obviously had been, and it's so great to see you two together. You can tell it must be Passover that the sisters are in town together. That's fabulous. So obviously the San Francisco community, it was important. They grew a lot. They had a lot of wealth. They did things to organize and to give a lasting legacy of the Jewish community. And so it's important that we remember that wherever Jews lived, they tried to give a lasting emphasis, a lasting legacy for the community, and that Israel Benjamin was just really impressed with the ability that within just 8 years that they really were able to create such a strong foundation. Any thoughts or anything to add? Any surprises at all? I know with David having traveled and been a part of the San Francisco community, any other thoughts to add? Carol, go ahead.
A question.
Sure.
When were the present buildings that you showed built? Because they have such similar architecture with the domes, and I wanted to ask about that.
That's a great question. I know that only one part, I'm actually going to go back. Only one part is of this is the original building, and then they've added so much to it. I haven't been there in probably 25 years, and this picture was my picture from a trip, and this one I was able to get from their website. So I admit I don't have the best of knowledge as far as when the updates on the building, but I can get that for you.
Well, the reason I ask is that my Temple Bethel in San Antonio has that dome, and it was built around the 1920s.
Yeah.
From the earlier structure was on the square downtown, and I just wondered how this architecture came to be, so prevalent everywhere.
That is an excellent question, and I would throw that out to the group. I would definitely say there is a similarity between this, I think, and is anyone familiar with the temple in Atlanta? That this building also reminds me of, or both of them with that same dome, reminds me of the way that, maybe I've just got it in my mind, but
our temple in Birmingham has the same dome.
Yeah, and I think
Temple
that maybe
Emmanuel. You're
right, that in those early 1900s, 1920s, that was a common, and some of it, now I do have to be honest, some has to do with the architecture of, depending on what the state laws or the city laws, that it couldn't be taller than certain buildings right? Like there were some, I'm trying to remember which communities that they couldn't allow, anything to be taller than the state capitol, or they couldn't allow anything to be, so they could allow certain, I don't know. So I will definitely do some research, because synagogue architecture is something that fascinates me too. Good questions. Okay, so I wanted us to take a little turn again to some interesting characters, now that we've sort of set the scene for still that we're in the Wild West, but we're still obviously developing an economy. We have, as gold and silver comes into play, there are Jews from Europe who have settled here and who are giving great dollars to their community. And then there's some Wild West folks. And in fact, although they've been able to develop some responsibility, again, in the West, in public office, that they might not have been able to acquire on the East Coast. We've talked about that in the very beginning of the class, that this wilderness minhag, if you will, these customs of the Wild West, allowed for Jews to not only settle, but to also be accepted in leadership roles. And so another gentleman that I want to introduce you to, who actually, before we get to Calvaro, this is Governor Washington Bartlett. So this is very early in California's history. But first, before I want to tell you about the Jews in Yerba Buena. The first Jews arrived in San Francisco, which, sure, we've been talking about the city by the bay and where, Tony Bennett left his heart. But the original the original name of San Francisco was actually Yerba Buena. And that, we know, Jews entered that area in the 1840s. By the end of the decade, again, or the beginning of the 1850s, Jewish pioneers were making large contributions to the growth of the community. The settlement's name was officially changed to San Francisco and became part of the United States in the following year. Now, much like the Texas leaders that we described early in this course, we had leaders that might not have had the same commitment to Judaism as others. Washington Bartlett, this gentleman pictured here, was born in Savannah, Georgia in 1824 of a Sephardic mother, Sarah Melhado. He arrived in San Francisco in 1849 as part of that gold rush. He and his brothers established newspapers in the Bay City, and in 1853. In 1857, he leaves journalism entirely and enters the legal profession. He advertised his new practice regularly in Rabbi Julius Ekman's Jewish newspaper, The Weekly Gleaner. So we know that he came from a Jewish mother. Again, one of the things that we've learned in our Southern Jewish class is so often Sephardic Jews who were native to even areas like Savannah maybe didn't have the same religious fervor. It was, but not to judge, that was, what he practiced. We do know that he gave to charitable causes, but didn't necessarily belong to the Jewish community. In 1873, he was elected to the California State Senate, and then he was elected mayor of San Francisco in 1882 and won again in 1884. He was elected governor of California on the Democratic ticket in 1886. Washington Bartlett was an honest politician in a very corrupt era of California politics, and he manifested a deep concern for the public's welfare. Washington Bartlett never married, interestingly enough, and he died in office as governor in 1887. So it's hard to say what motivated him, what kept him going, why as a bachelor, but it's interesting that the very first not the first California governor, but he was the first Jewish governor of California at a time when there weren't a lot of Jews holding such large office in politics. Now we're going to go through a few more of our pioneers. These I mentioned last week about John C. Fremont, another explorer. Well, John C. Fremont couldn't do it alone. And in reality, there was a gentleman named Solomon Nunez Carvalho. This is him. The picture on the left is his picture. It's a self-portrait. The other is a photograph of himself. And interestingly enough, we know that the first Jewish pioneer arrived in Los Angeles in 1841 and was listed in the Mexican census in 1844. To give some more statistics about how many Jews were living in Mexican-held California, we know that in 1844. By 1850, the United States Census listed 8 people of Jewish names living in Los Angeles. By 1870, it rose to 330 out of a total Los Angeles population of only 5,000. Which at that time was 5.77% of the total population. So the Jewish population there was such a big group of Angelenos that were Jewish is the bottom line. So to tell you a little bit about Solomon, he was born in Charleston, South Carolina, trained as an artist, later took up the new medium of photography, and he joined up with J.C. Fremont's 5th expedition to the West as its artist and photographer. And again, it's trying to imagine, while Fremont was able to take these expeditions, they would need people like a documentarian, if you will, to be able to not only track and take care of maps, but to really show and capture what they see along this wild frontier. And so Carvalho joined Fremont, trying to find a suitable route for a railroad across the Rocky Mountains and the Continental Divide. So no easy walk in the park, if you will. Clearly, this was a serious trek. Carvalho taught himself to paint, and then he learned the art of making a daguerreotype. And I know I'm probably mispronouncing that. Basically, this was, and if anyone knows how to say that, if there's a photographer in the group, please shout it out. Basically, he was making prints on silver and copper plates. So if you could imagine how much stuff he had to schlep along this journey in the Rocky Mountains just to be able to capture the kind of art on a silver plate for him to be able to take an image of the an early photograph, if you will. The expedition was difficult and it was dangerous. Carvalho's equipment was very heavy. And there was, of course, think about the Colorado Rockies where it can snow even in June, right? So there were extreme temperatures, sometimes as cold as low as 30 below zero. And the process of making one picture could take more than an hour. In December, the party ran out of supplies. That's never good. Just ask the Donner Party. That's not good. And so Carvalho had to leave his equipment behind. When their food supply ran out, the men slaughtered their horses and their mules. Now, at first, Carvalho said that he wasn't going to eat unkosher meat. Soon, however, you see a pattern from some of the other people that we've studied before. He realized that the Jewish law required him to eat unkosher food rather than die. So finally, in February of 1854, the expedition reached the Mormon settlement of Parowan, Utah. Remember, that whole part of what is Nevada, Utah today is now known as, or at this time was known as Deseret. And so they got to Parowan. He weighed less than 100 pounds. The settlers nursed him and his companions back to health. And from that part in Utah, Carvalho traveled to Salt Lake City to meet with Brigham Young, the Mormon leader. Now, Young, like Carvalho, who Carvalho was a Bible scholar, and so he invited Carvalho to join him at a meeting with Walkera, the chief of the Ute tribe. And Carvalho sketched the two men as they talked about a way to settle the problems between the Mormon and Native American people. Carvalho finally left Utah for Los Angeles, where he became one of the founders of that city's Jewish communities. He helped start the first Jewish organization in the city, the Los Angeles Hebrew Benevolent Society. And soon, however, he returned to the wife and children that he had left behind in Baltimore. So as we said, Los Angeles remained a small Western town until after the Civil War. Only a few thousand settlers there in a jumble of flat roof houses that spread across that time what was the prairie. So I want to introduce you to Carvalho through his own words. And so here's a little bit from his journal. Can anyone read that for me?
I will.
Okay, thank you.
One of my feet was badly frozen and I walked with much pain and difficulty. I was the last man on the trail and my energy and firmness almost deserted me. Alone, disabled, with no possible assistance from mortal man, I felt my last hour had come. I finally came into camp at about 10 o'clock at night. It requires a personal experience to appreciate the intense mental suffering which I entered that night.
I just struggle imagining what that must have been like. By the way, this text comes from, he wrote a best-selling account of his expedition with Fremont called The Incredible Incidents of Travel and Adventure in the Far West in 1856. And so let's talk about that intense mental suffering. What do you think? Are you going to sign up and start being I think it's bad enough trying to imagine eating, mules and horses, much less trying to wait 1 hour for a photo. It really changes it makes me appreciate how quickly we can take a photo on our phone these days, right? All right. Oh, sorry, Carol, did you have your hand up?
Where was he going? From where to where?
That he was the last man on the trail. Each one was walking separately, but they were still camping. And that just seems like they would have stayed together with things.
Well, and
maybe
so
because
often,
his
it's a
feet
good
were so
point.
badly
And again,
frozen. I have no problem with this.
yeah, well, what would happen is very often they might be all taking they would have different packs and they'd have different amounts to carry. So one guy might have been faster than another and he might have been able to move at a different pace. And especially if he's walking with it was a matter that they had the trail, but yeah, he definitely felt alone for sure. And Joe, I know I think you had asked a question too.
Oh, I was just wondering, I was just wondering why, like Carol said, he was alone, but then I reread it, but it would have been very, very dangerous to travel anywhere along there alone.
Right.
So I'm sure, hopefully he caught up with him, but still you can encounter all kinds of things out there alone, especially late at night. I can't imagine that they didn't at least walk in pairs or something, but I guess not.
Hard to know exactly, but just that the intensity of it is really what stood out. Well, I want, as I promised, to introduce you to another part of my home state, Austin, Nevada, which if you've ever been to Austin, Nevada, I would have to give you money because there is pretty much nothing left except there are, I believe, a few trailers, but beyond that, Austin is not at all what is seen in this picture now. Because as I have to kind of go over a little bit of another piece of history that I started to infer a moment ago, which is it's important to remember when we think of the West that we think of the Fremont expedition, but we also have to think of the Mormon territories because the states as we know them didn't originally have those shapes, right? So my little state of Nevada with its funky, elbow didn't look like that in the 1850s. And in fact, it was all, again, this part of the state of Deseret, which was founded by the Mormons, the members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in 1847. Now, we'll get more into Utah in just a moment. But on the frontier, even the story of Passover was seen through a special lens. So Fred Hard was a newspaper editor in the mining town of Austin, and he wrote the following story that I'm going to share in their words in just a moment. In 1864, when he wrote this, there were 150 Israelites living there, including 3 families. So I'd love another reader to help me to learn a little bit about what was happening in Austin in 1864.
I'll do it.
Thank you.
There are here about 150 Israelites, including 3 families, and the progress that they have made toward the advancement of the true principles of the Jewish faith is actually praiseworthy. The Israelites of this town have a Hebrew Benevolence Association with nearly 60 members. This society is founded on the same basis and the same laudable views as the first Hebrew Benevolent Society of San Francisco. The society have procured a suitable burying ground, and such is the stride of advancement. The Israelites have placed themselves by their meritorious actions on the highest scale of civilization, and as I know many of your subscribers read with pleasure any news from this portion of Nevada territory, you should be fully informed of anything worthy of the notice of an Israelite, the San Francisco Hebrew.
Record, thank you, Sandy. You get extra gold points for saying Nevada correctly. So my hat's off to you. Y'all know that I get very possessive when someone says Nevada. Ooh, makes my skin crawl. Okay, so that's step 1. Now that was done in 1864. Let's look at Austin, fast forward to what happens. Can y'all read that? Is that too small of a text on the slide?
Now we can see it.
All right. Would you like to take the 1882, Sandy, or is there someone else who can volunteer? I was worried it might cut off on the slide.
No, I'll do it.
All right.
This is 1882.
Uh-huh.
The present population of Austin is 11. They may have subdivided into 9 males and 2 females. There are 8 adults, of whom 7 are males, and 3 children. Of the children, 2 were boys and 1 is a girl. The mother of these children is not a born Jewess, but she joined the faith and is, I believe, as sincere as though a liberal-minded one, as though she had been born of Jewish parents. She is the wife of an American Hebrew. All of the other males are unmarried, although one of them has once been married. The father of these children sent some 4 years ago, upon the birth of a boy, to San Francisco, California, over 600 miles, for a mohel, in order that his son might be admitted into the Abrahamic covenant. When it is known that he pays no attention whatsoever to religious observances, and this involved an expense of $250, this is worth noting as an evidence of the strong attachment to the due to his faith. Though he does not fast upon Yom Kippur, yet he closes his store, which is more than I can say for others of the same faith in this town. At last Passover, he was the only one here who had matzah, although others who had lately come from the old country were not ashamed to eat leaven. They did not even have the excuse of poverty as a cloak for their violation of the Messiah Act injunction. Upon Rosh Hashanah, all the stores owned by Jews, of which there were 3, were in full blast. Minyan is out of the question, with the exception of one family at Lewis, about 20 miles distance. There are no other Hebrews in our county. 2 Israelites are interned here, both of whom met violent deaths. One was killed by an accident in the mines. The other was murdered, the American Hebrew.
Yeah. So what happens to the city of Austin from the Jewish community perspective from 1864 to 1882?
Shrunk almost to nothing.
Right. Right. And I do want to pick up, Scott asked a question about, I just saw in the chat, as far as, how is it that if someone lived in Mexico, often, it's not like they had the same kind of border patrol. And so what would happen is people would just come in, they'd start to settle. It's not that they would necessarily become Mexican citizens, but they'd be able to travel and develop the ability to stay there. So
But they were recognized as American citizens still?
Not necessarily. They would just immigrate there, and they could get away with being, this was such out there territory that they would be allowed to,
okay.
Right. So there wasn't like the same kind of
Do what
city
they
government.
want.
It was, yeah. Plus
Okay.
the landowners of Mexico also, they had almost like a serfdom, right? That you would have, the different landowners would be collective in some of those communities. And so they might be able to befriend one of the landowners to allow them to live there. And then that enabled them to almost like I said, it's sort of like, I think of a feudal system to a certain extent. Okay. But I know we're getting back to Austin, Nevada. So we had some clues in that. Could you tell what Austin was known for? Any thoughts?
Single people.
So yes, there was a lot of single people. Why were they single? Sounds like a
gold
ship
rushers?
happened in place.
Was that a stopping point for the gold rushers of 49 or something perhaps?
And the silver rush. And so Austin, if I could, throw up the state of Nevada for you, Austin is smack dab in the middle. So it's really just outside of a mountain range and a whole lot of desert. There really isn't a lot there. So, it's just to put it in perspective, it's not very far from Battle Mountain. Has anyone seen the new movie that's come out called Nomadland? Okay, so it's up for some Oscars. The character there is settled in this. They're very linked to the mines, and when a mine shuts down, the whole town shuts down. Well, that movie is set in modern times. This, of course, is set in the 1860s. But the reality is there's not a lot of difference. Not much has changed in Austin, Nevada, and that was part of the when the town was thriving. It was thriving around the mining district of the 1850s, 1860s, and the railroad, much like how we talked about where the railroad would go, would really make or break a town. The same thing would happen in some of these smaller Nevada towns. So while the Central Railroad was built to connect Austin with the Transcontinental Railroad, by the time the silver boom ended, Austin goes belly up. And while there was a great deal of interest in uranium deposits in the area, which of course would later fuel the nuclear industry, the ore in it proved to be of really late quality. So gold and silver mining was the only thing that kept the communities going. And as that started to dry up, then they would remain with turquoise mining. But that's really all that was happening. So while in the very beginning, Jews would live there, and as we kind of reflected back, they had 150 Jews living in 1864. Nevada becomes a state. Bless you, Adina. They end up having where people were moving, the mines driving up. It was interesting to see how a community in that second text, I'm going to throw that back up there again. What we're learning from, hold on, let me go back from current slide. That what we're seeing has to do, they're really trying to make a pitch that there's some pros and cons, that they're surviving, right? That we have a mother of these children chooses Judaism. She, all the other males, as I think it was Sandy who said, they're unmarried. They are all trying their best to keep their life going. They had to bring in a moil. What are some of the other things that who's eating matzah? Are they following Passover?
Generally just the one person.
Yeah.
Nobody else was.
But as a positive, the other I think important part, of course, is that there at least some folks are trying. There are definitely those Jews who might be a name only, and that they are, they have, in the original part, they did build a Jewish community that had, as I'm going through, that they kept a Jewish burial site. Okay, so, but I still think it's great that, at least they tried to keep some form of Passover in at least one of their ways. Now, going back to talking about the Mormon community and about Salt Lake City, it was not an easy thing to come in, to journey, to make a life in this very desert life. And after many arduous journeys, I'd like to introduce you to Fanny Brooks, born Isabel Brooke. And she finally found a home for her Jewish family of 6 in the most unlikely place, that of Mormon-dominated Salt Lake City. There, the family prospered economically and personally, in large part through the efforts of this incredible Jewish pioneer. She was born in 1837 in a German village, unusually well educated for a woman, graduating school with high honors. She met Julius Brooks, who had returned from the gold rush in California, with stories that fascinated this young woman. And so they married in 1853 and set off for the New World, with Fanny playing French and German folk songs for their shipmates on her guitar. They stayed only briefly in New York City before heading to Galena, Illinois, where they joined a train of 100 wagons bound for California. Now, Fanny and her husband's story was later told by their daughter, Eveline Brooks Auerbach, who recounted tales of, that's actually the baby in the far right picture, who recounted tales of dusty heat, flooded roads, and the poor cooking of their Yankee traveling companions. The family stopped for a few months in Salt Lake City, but pressed on to Marysville, California, where they opened a store. Over the next 10 years, the growing family moved to San Francisco, then to Portland, to Boise, Idaho, and many other small towns along the way. They finally settled back in Salt Lake City, sandwiched between the stables of the Pony Express Company and a gambling saloon. Now, I should say, Fanny had ambitions of her own. She opened a boarding house with a dining room that seated up to 40 people at a time. Now, the business prospered, but was threatened by an 1868 edict from Brigham Young, who stated, of course, that's the Mormon leader that we talked about earlier, who forbidded Mormons from doing business with non-Mormons. Mormon merchants put an all-seeing eye sign with the inscription, "Holiness to the Lord," over the entrance to their stores to indicate their religious affiliation. Where other non-Mormon businesses sold out and left town, Fanny Brooks demanded a meeting with Brigham Young to make her case. She described to the Mormon leader how much time and effort she and her family had spent building their businesses and her desire to stay in her adopted hometown. Now, I have to say, Brigham Young was an incredibly powerful man, as you can imagine. And he actually made an exception in the Brookses' case. The church leader remained on good terms with the family and was supportive of their Jewish faith to the extent of donating the land for the Jewish cemetery. Encouraged by their acceptance, the Brookses opened a millinery shop. Julius purchased the merchandise, Fanny managed the accounts, and ran the store. By 1879, Julius had built an elegant European-style shopping mall named the Brooks Arcade. Having prospered in their Western home, the Brooks traveled to Europe and often returned to Germany to visit family and friends. On August 21st, 1901, Fanny unfortunately died in the town in which she was born, leaving behind a legacy as a skilled businesswoman and an active Jewish citizen of Utah. She and her husband are buried in the Jewish section of the Salt Lake City Cemetery. Does that, I mean, I guess part of it is growing up in very heavily populated Mormon Las Vegas, that this was a community that, especially at that time, that women did not necessarily have a very active voice in the community. And for Fanny to be able to stand up and get what she wanted and to be able to impress Brigham Young, I think really impresses me. And knowing that, again, that the Mormon population or the Mormon community that was not inclusive at that time actually listened to Fanny and she was able to find favor despite all odds. Now, another amazing woman. Sandy, I wasn't sure. Did you have your hand up?
Yeah, I did. Before
Okay.
we go on to the next,
Sure.
what was the governance of Utah at that time? It was not a state, didn't become a state until almost the turn of the century.
Yep.
Wasn't California and Nevada had become states. So
Right.
you know what it was? Was
Yeah,
it
so
territory?
Utah, again, this is where they sort of went around Utah, if you will, and I'll tell you exactly. I just want to get the correct year, because Utah it still remains part of this Deseret territory, and that meant that it was under Mormon leadership.
Okay.
Here we go. So Utah it doesn't become a state until 1896.
Right.
So that's a long period of time with, Nevada becoming a state in 1864. And it's really another fascinating component to how Utah plays in conjunction with Nevada. So not only was this all part of the Mormon territory, but it also, of course, I mentioned last week that it plays a role with the Civil War and the fact that the silver helps to fund the Union side. Now, the southern territory of Utah is a pretty fertile ground, and if there's actually a part of the Dixie category, the Dixie, what am I trying to use? Oh, good. I need more coffee. I can't find the word. But there was the Mormon leadership would actually sell cotton to when they could grow it. Part of southern Utah is known as the Dixie Colony is that they were selling cotton to make fabric for the Confederates' uniforms. So it's interesting to see how these two states developed more rivalry and history while still all being under the Mormon control. And it's challenging because we're looking at it from a historical perspective, not that we're making judgments about a people's religion, but just how much that religion drove again, the thoughts, the theories, the leadership of these communities. I don't know if that answered your question or combobulated it more, but knowing that Utah didn't become a state until 1896, that's 30 years of growing Mormon leadership in that area.
I also had a question going back to Austin and its demise.
Sure.
Could the demise of the town caused either people had a choice, they either moved or if they stayed, maybe it was easier to assimilate in that deteriorating deal, or did they come to that territory really unaffiliated or in name only? Do you know?
Well, I would definitely have to say that is the big question of the class. That we know that there are those folks who it felt so rooted in their own bedrock of their personalities and of their own character that their Jewish values rang true. And then there are those who were just trying to survive. Whether it's, starting off saying, I'm not going to eat that horse because it's not kosher, to Pekuei Hanefesh, I just need to eat and survive. So at some point, did they, which came first, the chicken or the egg, or which came first? Did they want to find a Jewish successful community, or were they willing to go down with the ship because they thought that that's what they could do to survive? For some cases, I think Austin, Nevada, that big group of people, it wasn't a big draw. Jewish people were able to provide the supplies. They weren't necessarily the miners themselves. And so when the businesses went out, they went and found elsewhere. But I think there's a yes and for sure.
I also found it interesting when you went back to San Francisco, and I don't know what year you said, but I think it was in the 50s, when there were 4,000 Jews out of 119,000. That percentage is about what we have in a lot of cities, between 2 and 4%, right, with the exception of New York. And, but I think in Dallas, my guess would be we're probably about 3%. But I thought it was interesting that even in the 1850s, that it was about the same percentage. LA was a little higher.
Right.
Anyway, I just found that interesting.
And I'm so glad that you picked up on that. That's exactly why I threw it in there. It's an interesting thing that even when we remain this small percentage, that it's still similar to the way it is today. So I think it's an interesting thing. And this was a wild time, but yet there's still some similarities in the number of people that have come, what drives them, what brings them here, and how we're able to continue to grow. And I also, there's one other gal that Fanny's determination really inspires me. But there's another lady that I have to share about that really is something else. So let me get on to, so thank you for pointing that out, Sandy. And let's get back to our next story, which is, here we go. Let me just move my screen around a little bit. I want to introduce you to, how many of you have heard of Wyatt Earp? Jennifer and I talk, right? Like, if we, at some point in time, if you've played Cowboys and Indians back in the day, or if, you know, we've seen from the old Westerns and newsreels, chances are you've probably heard of Wyatt Earp. Well, wouldn't you know that Wyatt Earp actually, well, I'll tell you about Josephine Marcus because she deserves her own storyline herself. She was impulsorious. Impulsorious? That's a new word. She was impulsive, adventurous, and outspoken. Josephine Sarah Marcus Earp ran away from home when she was only 17 years old. 2 years later, she joined destinies with Western lawman, gambler, and entrepreneur Wyatt Earp. For 47 years together, they roamed the West, mingling with well-known Westerners on both sides of the law. Her name was rarely in print until her published memoir revealed an overlooked Western folk female hero, long on daring, short on propriety, and of all things, very Jewish. She was the third of 4 children. So Josephine Sarah Marcus Earp was born in all places, Brooklyn, New York, in 1861 to German immigrants Sophie and Hyman, also known as Henry Marcus. When she was 7 years old, the family moved to San Francisco. In 1879, the Pauline Markham Theater Company came to town, and Josephine ran away to be part of the theater troupe. In the Arizona territory, she fell for Johnny Behan, a divorced, bankrupt Politico. So clearly, Josephine knew how to pick them. Not really. So she gets together with this gentleman, this actor, and her family comes and retrieves her. But Johnny followed and convinced her gullible greenhorn parents, if you will, of his honorable intentions. In May 1880, she joined him in Tombstone, Arizona, but they didn't marry. Her gaze shifted instead to 30-ish, tall, handsome, and iconic Wyatt Earp, who, despite his common law wife, so he also has some marital challenges, stared back. And from there, their romance blazed through the shootout at the OK Corral. The Earp brothers, of course, were key participants in that, and related trials and vendettas. After Tombstone, the couple lived in other Western boom towns, including Nome, Alaska, Los Angeles, and intermittently San Francisco, at times with Josephine's parents. In the 1920s, financially aided by her sister Henrietta, the couple seesawed between mining and oil ventures in Southern California, promoting a new movie about Wyatt Earp's lawman exploits and writing his life story. The unpublished manuscript intrigued journalist Stuart Lake, who projected his own Wyatt Earp biography. After Wyatt died in 1929, warfare exploded between Josephine Earp and the writer Lake. Issues included his commercialized depiction of her husband and unflattering portrayal of her. Wyatt Earp, Frontier Marshal, has lots of passages stricken, came out in 1931 and fueled 50 years of Wyatt Earp mania, both good and bad, in print and film. So Josephine comes up with another book called I Married Wyatt Earp, which she wrote with Mabel Earp Kaysen and Kaysen's sister, Viola Earp Ackerman. and it was edited by Glenn Boyer, who was a well-known Western writer in 1967. Boyer fine-tuned her facts and now had other researchers working on the book. Notably, the cover photograph became a discreet cameo of young Josephine Earp. It's in dispute. They're trying to figure out if it was indeed her or not. Boyer long maintained that Johnny Behan took the photo of her in Tombstone in 1880. Challengers say that Boyer adopted it from a full-length near nude portrait of earliest 20th century vintage copyrighted in 1914. I'm hoping that Jen is grabbing the book or something like it. Aha! Oh, there we go. So that's part of this story, this narrative that I'm telling you comes from the book that Jen has in her.
We're ordering the Wyatt Earp. I love that book. When I read that came out about that he was buried, I haven't got to the punchline yet.
I haven't gotten to that yet either.
But I got that book from the library, and Sherry's going to buy it because it's a terrific. It's so interesting.
I mean, the things that these people came. I mean, they.
Can you put the name of the book in the chat, please?
What was that?
Can you put the name of the book in the chat? Please?
Thank you. Yeah,
Thank you.
I'll put one of them if Jen, if you can put the other one, that's great. Thanks, Rochelle. So again, so they made, unfortunately, so much money was being made on their images, right? So the fact that there was just this mania over Wyatt Earp, and that over these years, they would circulate as a novelty company, that people would sell postcards and pictures and imagery of the family. Now, when Wyatt died, Josephine buried his ashes in the Marcus family plot in the Little Hills of Eternity near San Francisco. Josephine Sarah Marcus Earp died in 1944, and now her remains are buried with his. But the collision of Jewish and cowboy cultures that epitomize the Union goes on, because Wyatt Earp enthusiasts have made the gravesite the most visited Jewish cemetery. And once they even stole the poor man's tombstone. So it's really, she, if you can, and I'll, once again, I think Jen's put the information, The Lady at the OK Corral, fabulous. That is the best book. The one that I've been using is Where They Lived, which also tells some story, and I'll put that in there shortly as well. Now, I have just a few as we start to get closer. I can't help but to share, because we all have those images of what our rabbis are, right? Like when you think of a rabbi, you think of maybe a Rabbi Zeleny who's eloquent and, you know, a strong in stature and strong in voice, or Rabbi Stern, or, you know, Rabbi Sunshine, leaders in our communities who really go out of their way to be mensches. Well, the Wild West rabbis were maybe a little different. So this is actually a picture that how things got a little bit ugly in the Wild West. So I'd like to ask you, can you imagine a gunfight between a rabbi and the president of a synagogue? You know, we all have to choose a prayer book sometimes, and sometimes that can be an incredibly hard, painful challenge for a congregation. Contract negotiations, never easy. This took it to a whole new level. So I want to introduce you to Rabbi Moses May and Abraham Waldman of Beth Israel in Portland, Oregon. Got to watch out for them in Portland. Okay, so they had that kind of confrontation. The congregation was actually founded in 1859 and had a series of religious leaders before Rabbi May had even arrived. Now, services were conducted in the Orthodox tradition using the prayer book Minhag Ashkenaz. May wanted to use Minhag America, which we talked about actually a couple sessions ago. This was the book that Rabbi Isaac Mayer Wise had made really famous and had been publicizing within the Reform community. It was, you know, the more different congregations were using it. So I think at one point in time, like this was the prayer book of our earliest temple, Emmanuel. So members of the congregation were divided between this more traditional Minhag Ashkenaz and this Minhag America. Well, then there's the Portland Minhag, which was created by the board of directors of the synagogue. Waldman, the president-elect of the synagogue, didn't want to see the Portland prayer book changed. It was this combination between the Ashkenazic tradition, this Eastern European tradition, and this American more reform. I'm using that as a noun, not or as a verb, not a noun, but you know, this wise version of the prayer book. Well, he and the rabbi had been arguing for years, and their dispute erupted in a fist fight and shootout on a Friday morning, no less, in October of 1880, under the window of the Esmond Hotel, where President Rutherford B. Hayes just happened to be staying. So to make it worse, the President of the United States is there. Now, Rabbi May had been talking to a friend outside the hotel when Waldman came up from behind him. Waldman grabbed May by the collar and hit him between the eyes, breaking his glasses. The rabbi, so yes, the president takes the first hits the rabbi, but then the rabbi pulls out the gun and shoots his attacker. His first shot missed, but his second shot tore through Waldman's coat. Another man grabbed the rabbi before he could reload and shoot again. And the fight, because the president, Rutherford B. Hayes, President Hayes, was staying in the hotel, it made national news. The Daily Standard of Portland headlined the story. This quote here, "Pastoral Relations, How Rabbi May and Brother Waldman Served the Lord." It ended by noting that Waldman, quote, "a well-known and highly respected citizen, was arrested in the afternoon and fined for assault. But as far as can be learned, Rabbi May was not molested," unquote. When the story was heard back east, Rabbi Isaac Mayer Wise wrote, quote, "Mr. Waldman was not hurt, but the rabbi was soundly thrashed for being such a poor marksman," unquote. Wise ended by writing, "It is a pity that Israel should have produced a shooting clergyman." So it's hard to imagine, and hopefully we don't have any gun-toting rabbis. I mean, not to make a judgment call there. I'm sure there are those out there, but to think of a Wild West gun-toting rabbi, to have a fight over, of all things, a Siddur. Now, the last part of the West that I want to introduce you to and go over is that, of course, of the Goldwaters. Again, we started off the conversation by the impact that Jews made in procuring and in selling goods in the West and in these pioneer frontier towns. You might recognize the family name because, of course, we're talking about that Goldwater, the relatives of Barry Goldwasser. And by the 1870s, the main streets of Trinidad, Colorado, Prescott, Arizona, Virginia City, Nevada, Albany, Oregon, and Tacoma, Washington, all held clusters of Jewish stores selling dry goods and all kinds of provisions. Other shops offered services of barbers and watchmakers and tailors, saloons, restaurants, etc. In Santa Fe, New Mexico, the Spielberg brothers bought produce, sheep, and cattle from farmers and ranchers and sold them to the United States Army and to the Indian pueblos and reservations. As Western towns grew in size, the needs of the community grew, and many Jews stepped up to serve in leadership roles. Jewish businessmen were active in Masonic lodges, service groups, and politics. Michael Goldwasser, which was later anglicized to Goldwater, was born in 1821. Ready for this? He was one of 22 children. 22 in Konin, Poland. He left Poland in 1837 to avoid army service. Despite their efforts in California, Big Mike, as he was known, that's the gentleman on the right, on my right, your right on the screen. So as he was known, he was 6'4", moved to Arizona after his business in Southern and Northern California wasn't successful. In Prescott, Arizona, success continued for his son, Morris Goldwater. That's the gentleman on the left. That's the uncle to Senator Barry Goldwater, who organized the local bank, financed the railroad to Phoenix, and served as a mayor for 22 years. And in fact, here are Barry's own words about the family. So I have one other. Can someone be a reader for me? Joe, you look like you unmuted and were ready to take that on.
I really don't like Barry Goldwater, but I'll
Oh,
read
no!
it anyway. Ugh. Politics aside, I really don't like
There
Barry. In spite of things you may hear and read, I would contend the thing the Goldwaters have done best for the past 100 years in Arizona is sell pants. At different times, there have been Goldwater stores in La Paz, Ehrenberg, Prescott, Parker, Seymour, Lynx Creek, Phoenix, Bisbee, Fairbank, Contention, Tombstone, Benson, and Crittenden. Not only are all the Goldwater stores gone now, but so are many of those towns. In the early days, our family tried to meet every need of their communities. At first, our store took pride in supplying most of the clothing, household, food, farm, and industrial needs of pioneer towns. A customer could be completely outfitted at Goldwater's from cradle to grave. There are pages in old company ledgers that actually relate the sale of babywear and hardware for coffins on the same day. We sold everything the prospector needed, from drill bits and black powder to demijohns to whiskey. We stocked groceries and stock feed, shoes and hats, furniture from Austria and herrings from Holland, horseshoes and horse collars. We had lamps and rugs for the front parlor, spices and soap for the kitchen, and anything needed for the outhouse. Goldwater's was a complete store.
So thank you for putting politics aside and being able to reach out about the Goldwaters. You know, I think that a part of why we're ending with them is the ability that, you know, like so many, I think the biggest takeaway of this era was that when there was a need, Jews found a way to make it happen. And it wasn't always easy. It definitely wasn't easy. That it took a lot of character and grit, people with a lot of personality. And something that Sandy reflected on was, were these people willing to make this trip because they were, you know, looking to survive and plant their Jewish roots? Or had they already assimilated? Had they already, you know, were they just trying to survive? And we know that they did try to establish, some would put down some roots, but unfortunately, because of how spread out these communities would be, just like here in Texas, the communities of Corsicana, like Austin, Nevada, as the community shifted, we went and it changed. So it's interesting now, while we look at what happened in the 1800s, what could happen to our communities in the 2080s? What could we think of our communities now? How will things shift and change? It's really anyone's guess. We'd like to think that we've learned everything we can, but the truth is, it's a fascinating journey of Jewish history. So I hope that you've enjoyed this workshop of Pioneer Jews. And I know that we'll be coming back together. I'm presenting another class on thugs who knew Torah. So if you missed my life story, if you will, the story about Jewish gangsters, I'll be presenting that again. Adina or Rochelle, if you want to share any last words of closure before we wrap up today.
So I just wanted to say that thank you, Barry. This has been really fascinating and fun. And Thugs Who Knew Torah is also a lot of fun. One or two of the group participated when Barry taught it a little over a year ago. But most of you have not experienced it yet. And it's the first thing she brought to us, and it was great. So we're hoping to see most of you in that class that starts mid-April. And any questions, reach out to any of us. We're happy to help you.
And it'll be the same. I'll be showing film clips and different, and of course, you know, being a Jewish educator who just happened to have a dad named Lefty who was in the casino industry for 60 years, I definitely have many stories that all roads lead to Vegas, and we will talk about the immigrant. It really is a class about the immigrant experience and life in the big cities and how Jews acclimated to those big cities. And how some turn to a life of crime. So, not to say that my dad did, but, well, thanks everyone. I really appreciate it. It's been fun going through this Texas and West history with you.
Barry, thank
Thank you,
you.
Barry. Great class.
Very
Thanks,
good.
everybody.
Thank you,
Look
Barry.
forward to the
Thanks
April.
very
one.
much.
Yeah.
All right.
Forward to the
Hag
next
Sameach,
one.
everybody. Have a
Hag
good day.
Sameach. I hope everyone has a very happy Passover.
Everybody. Hag Sameach.
Have a good
Thanks, Samaya.
Thanks.